My name is Ryan Anderson. I have the great good fortune of serving as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And tonight we're going to have a conversation with Clare Morell, the author of The Tech Exit, a practical guide. I have to read the rest to freeing your kids and teens from smartphones. Came out earlier this year with Penguin Random House. It's really an excellent book, very readable, very practical, and very inspirational. Claire's been at EPPC for almost 5 years now. She came to us straight out of the first Trump administration, where she had served in the White House counsel's office and at the Department of Justice. She worked with Attorney General Bill Barr on some of the big tech work there and Section 230 work. For the past 4.5, almost 5 years now at EPPC, she's been originally focused on big tech, and we had a big tech project, and then we renamed that the Technology and Human Flourishing Project because we realized it was a lot larger than just big tech censorship. Much more important was the way in which technology could either advance or undermine human flourishing, especially as applied to children. And so Claire's really been the pioneer of many of the public policies that have been enacted at the state level for age verification for social media, age verification for obscenity, pornography websites. Most recently, she's put out some model legislation on age verification for AI chatbots, and she's done some work on AI in education. So, more or less all of the most recent technological innovations, how they intersect, particularly with children, with childhood development, with education, with human flourishing. That's been Claire's focus at EPPC for 5 years. And tonight we're going to focus again on this book. And so I thought I would just, open the question open the discussion with the question that every podcast host asks when they're interviewing a book author, which is, Claire, why did you write the book? Why did you think it was needed? What inspired you to take to do a joint maternity leave and book leave? So Claire wrote this book shortly after having your third child, if I have the
Yes.
timeline correct. Tell us, why you were crazy enough to do a maternity leave slash book leave with three children, I think ages like 4 and under at the time. Uh, what inspired it?
Yes. Oh man, looking back now, it was a crazy time, but I'm grateful that I had done a lot of the research. And actually, the book was really born out of a lot of the public policy research I had done the prior years. And so, the short answer is that I could not find a resource to recommend for parents that kind of gave parents permission to opt out entirely of smartphones and social media, and also explained how to do that, how it would be possible. So, my research in the public policy space had convinced me that smartphones and social media were extremely detrimental to our children's health and well being, and that the best protection was to opt out entirely. And so I would often be asked by parents when I was in these kind of policy settings for my personal advice or recommendations, what should I do for my own kids? And I would give that answer. Like, I'm not going to give smartphones and social media to my own children because of all the damage and the harms that I have so well researched. But they would push back, especially parents of teenagers, like, my child will be the only one without a smartphone. Like, how is this possible? Do you have a resource to recommend? So it set me off on this journey of reading all the parenting books I could find on technology. And I found them all deeply dissatisfying. They would kind of accurately, honestly assess the harms, but then the solutions they offered really fell far short of the problem, because I was studying kind of all the loopholes in the parental controls and how addictive the design was and why screen time limits weren't enough. But those were the main solutions they would offer to parents. Just put time limits and controls in place and talk to your kids about the dangers, and they'll be fine. And so that was kind of how the book was born. Actually, Ryan, out of a conversation I had with you, I said, I cannot find a book to recommend to parents that I would feel comfortable saying, this is really puts forward this type of solution and also walks parents through how to do it. And Ryan said to me, I think you should write that book. And so then that began, the journey to writing the book. And I always tell people I started out the book with this hypothesis, and conviction that a smartphone free childhood was necessary. But I really did have the question, like, is it possible? And if so, how have people done it? And from all the dozens of interviews that I did with families who have successfully opted out, I became overwhelmingly convinced that not only is it necessary? But it actually is possible. And it's the best thing that we can do for our kids. And I wanted to invite other parents then in to experience this. How had these families done this? And so that is kind of the culmination of the book, is really a step-by-step guide for parents and families.
Awesome. Um, so I know uh, in the book you use a really helpful analogy. And about half an hour ago, I'm in the basement right now. We finished, upstairs. We had dinner, and amazingly, my children still have Halloween candy left over. We're a week out from Thanksgiving, and so they all had a little sugar after dinner. And, so why not think of social media, smartphones as sugar that you can give your kids a little bit? The analogy you use is it's more like fentanyl. And, my wife and I, we would not be giving our kids a little fentanyl after dinner. Um, walk us through that analogy, and why that analogy and how do you apply it to social media?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of parents have treated screens kind of in the category of sugar, something that could be enjoyed in moderation, but in large amounts would be harmful. But all of my research had shown me actually the design, like the root level design, is inherently addictive.
Mm.
And brain studies show it acts on the brain the same way drugs, alcohol, tobacco, other inherently addictive substances act on the brain, with the kind of amount of dopamine released and how quickly it's released. And brain scans over time of heavy users of social media actually resemble the brain scans, the same structural brain changes as people addicted to highly addictive drugs. And so I wanted to kind of alarm parents a little bit with that analogy to say, it's meant to be provocative to say, really, screens, we've put them in the wrong category. We've treated them like sugar when they're really more like digital fentanyl. And the reason I say that is because of those neurological biochemical effects are actually much closer to an addictive drug than they are to sugar. And so that's kind of the whole thrust of the first chapter of the book, is trying to make the case for why then screen time limits aren't enough. And for the reasons you just described, I don't think any parent thinking of a inherently addictive product says, yeah, it's okay if my kid smokes one cigarette a day. We have a category for things that we know are, this is an inherently addictive product that's going to make you into an addict. And so we just completely restrict those. And we have to apply that same logic to screens. And I kind of go through all the reasons in that chapter, the effects on the nervous system, the effects on the brain, how these screens are really mimicking the same effects as these other addictive substances that no parent would give to their child in any amount. And so that's kind of the the thrust of it, and the root of it all is really the design. I try to unpack why these products are having these effects is because they are actually designed to do that. The likes, the metrics, the followers, the constant notifications, the interface of the screen, all of it is meant to elicit that dopamine response in the brain. And I explained, for those who are maybe not as in the weeds on all the science kind of literature, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it produces this kind of burst of pleasure from an activity or substance. But the dopamine doesn't actually produce lasting satisfaction or fulfillment. It just produces craving to make us want to do that thing again. And so what I explain about the screens is, even if a child is only on 15 minutes a day, in that amount of time, they're getting these constant hits of dopamine. And as soon as they log off, the brain actually plunges into a dopamine deficit state. It does not go back to a normal baseline. It's in a deficit. And so it creates a constant craving and compulsion for more. And so the time limit is never enough. And many parents remarked on this to me, just they thought, 20 minutes of screen time a day would be okay for their kids. But then they said it came to dominate their personality. It's all they thought about, is those 20 minutes they could get on. And that is precisely the design it was intended to have. That was the effect it was meant to have, because of those dopamine effects on the brain. And so children in particular are very vulnerable because their dopamine receptors are actually multiplying between the ages of 10 to 12, whereas at the same time, their prefrontal cortex, the part of our brains that are responsible for our impulse control and emotional regulation and self-control, isn't fully developed until age 25. And so these interactive screens for a child's brain is all gas pedal and no brakes. They don't have the ability to self regulate. And a short amount of time still creates a very strong, constant craving for more.
Um, so I imagine some parents who are watching, I mean, um, it's easy if your kids are still little, and so you never gave them the smartphone and you never gave them screen time or social media accounts. But I would imagine for many parents, what they've done is they've followed kind of the best practices that the tech companies themselves promulgated of you can have screen time limits and you can have parental controls and use it in moderation, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what they've done for their children. Um, and it just sounds like what you've just said is actually you've just given your children some like fentanyl with some moderation. It's moderate fentanyl use with some, intake limits, parental supervision, whatever. Um, that sounds all like bad news. What is the good news here? Like, what is the next step if you're a family and you're realizing maybe we should exit from what we've already engaged in?
Yes. And I just want to say, if you're a parent reading this and you think, oh no, like we've made a mistake, I just want you to know it's never too late. And that's actually why I wrote the book. I wanted to meet parents right where they're at. And so receiving the bad news can be hard sometimes, especially as a parent. But I mean, that's like so much of parenting. You operate with the best information that you have at the time. And so now that you have this new information, now that you understand, better the design of the technology and why the kind of approach of moderation, which is the approach that the culture has taken, the approach that the tech companies have pushed on parents, why that does not actually is not effective in fully shielding our children from the negative impacts of these technologies. I really offer an escape plan, and it's very simple. It just starts by detoxing from these devices. And I really recommend a 30-day digital detox. And there's a whole science behind detoxing that, as I was saying, those effects on the brain, what over time that means that kids end up in a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state, and so they become desensitized to pleasures in the real world, like things in nature or activities with family members actually start to feel boring or mundane or dull. But with a detox, the brain can actually recalibrate. It returns to a normal homeostasis baseline level of dopamine, and they actually begin to experience pleasure from the real world again. And so, a lot of these negative effects, especially in the brains of children, can be easily reversed with just a 30-day digital detox because it resets the child's nervous system, it resets the brain. And, just like any bad habit, breaking it at first is hard. So, all these families I spoke to who did these detoxes said that the first week was really hard. Their kids begged for the screens every day, but they kept going. And then they were just amazed at the results they saw in their kids that 2 weeks in, the kids had stopped asking for the screens and they were then playing independently again. Their creativity, their personality came back. They were actually able to self entertain themselves. Because so many parents tell me they think a detox, it just sounds impossible because they can't imagine dealing with their child without the screen. But the thing is, it seems impossible just because there is an addiction. But once there is this detox period, the child can actually flourish and thrive without the screen. And they really become the best version of themselves. And so many families said, if we had known this, we would have done this years ago. Like we didn't have to be so afraid of it. We could have just committed to doing this 30-day digital detox and seeing the results for ourselves. So I always encourage parents or families who are even like skeptical that this could really work, or skeptical that they could do this over the long term, to just try it out for 30 days. I mean, we do Whole30, we do all sorts of diets, fads, things for 30 days. It's not a very long period of time to just commit to trying this as a family, and to seeing the benefits in your kids. And so I really do kind of walk families exactly through how to do this, how to do a digital detox, how to fast from these digital technologies. And the message really is that it is never too late to reverse course, and a detox can benefit anyone at any age at any time.
So let me ask you a follow-up there. When you mentioned, the family could do the detox. I know, many of us have these devices for work purposes or, for family purposes in some cases, being able to talk to, my wife, blah, blah, blah. Do you think, is it the whole family who needs to do the detox or just the children? Or what is your advice to the grown-ups, to the parents. I imagine many of us have bad relationships with our devices as well. So, what is your advice there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's mainly about taking the screens away from the children, but I do encourage families to say, like, we're doing this as a family. And for the parents, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving up your smartphone entirely, but that during the detox period, you're really not being on your phone at all when you're with your kids, when you're in the home, that there's a lot of physical distance between you and the device, that you're really only using it for work purposes when you're out of the home. But when you're at home, you really are trying to detox together, and kind of avoiding screen entertainment and trying to instead fill your kids' time with that real life relationship, which is mainly, children mainly want their parents' attention. And so often we're the problem because we are looking down at our phones. And so then they're tempted to turn to their screen. And so I do kind of encourage families to really try to remove screens from family life completely. The detox recommends doing a screen sweep and just getting all the screens out of your house. And so again, understand if parents still need to have their phones for work purposes, but really trying to eliminate all the screens from the home and to be together as a family, pursuing those real life relationships and activities together, and to try to actually give a very positive vision to your kids of why you're doing the detox, what you're hoping to get out of it, and all the things you're going to do together as a family instead of the screens. Like, we're going to go for a family walk every night after dinner. We're going to play these board games as a family. So it does take intentionality and planning, but it really, you set yourself best up for success if parents are really team players, and if you're really intentional at building that positive kind of counterculture to the screens, which takes leadership from the parents to say, we're going to be doing these activities as a family, instead of screen entertainment.
Um, so continuing the kind of like drug analogy of, digital fentanyl, detoxing, how do you prevent like a relapse?
Mm.
The families that you interviewed, because it's one thing to do a 30-day digital detox, but then you slowly kind of like go back into your bad habits. I know, every New Year's resolution I've ever made, like first 30 days, January goes okay, and February, March, go back to my old self. Um, but you interviewed families that made this last, years long. They stuck with it. What is the secret sauce?
Yeah, well, the secret sauce was really kind of a lot of shared principles and practices in common that I took and put into this acronym FEAST, because I really wanted the book to be fundamentally a positive vision for families. And so if we're fasting from these particular digital mediums that are addictive, smartphones, tablets, social media, we want to help them feast on real life instead. And so I'll just briefly walk through that acronym, because honestly, all five of these commitments that make up the acronym were really key ingredients to success, to sustaining what I call the tech exit lifestyle over the long term. So F stands for find other families. And I think, anyone will recognize this. Like, this is the kind of inherent challenge in opting out, is you don't want your child to be the only one without a phone. And so it's really critical that you find other families to do this with you. And that doesn't mean it has to be every single child or, family in your child's class or their peer group, but just finding two or three other families that are part of your child's school class or your church, where whoever your child's peers are, figuring out those families and talking to them about this. And so I give so many examples of how really parents just talking to each other and working together, we can create these kind of counter communities where our children can thrive and they can have real, deep, meaningful friendships. They're not going to be socially isolated. They can have real friendships if we just talk to each other and opt out together. And so I give examples of neighborhoods where the moms on the street, it would just start as a conversation. We don't want our kids on phones. We want them playing outside. And just a few families getting together with their kids playing outside shifted the momentum on the whole street away from phones. And the mom said, now the pressure has become, don't be the parent that brings a smartphone into this great community we have going on. So they've actually kind of created counter pressures the other direction. And it really does just start by parents talking to each other. So I talk more at the end of the book about how public policy solutions can really help solve some of these collective action problems. But I also want to just empower parents like we can solve the collective action problems ourselves if we just band together and find other families and talk to each other. So talk to parents at your school, your neighborhood, your church. And then the E stands for explain, educate, and exemplify. This is another key kind of piece of the equation, especially because I get asked a lot, oh, don't these kids just go off and binge and go crazy on tech in college? And the answer for all these families was no, it was actually the exact opposite because they had formed their key habits, 0 to 18 without being dependent on a smartphone, that even if they got a smartphone in college, they were able to actually regulate themselves because they had this vision of themselves without the phone that always kind of served as a tether for them. But another part of it was that their parents had actually worked really intentionally to explain and educate the harms they were trying to protect them from. Even kind of coming alongside teenagers and watching a documentary as a family like The Social Dilemma, kind of exposed for their teens the business model behind social media and how these companies are just trying to manipulate you. And so I think it's important that we treat our kids as mini adults. We actually give them the understanding, the rationale behind our decisions. They're not just these rules handed down from on high, but they're grounded in a lot of proactive training, so our kids understand the dangers that are out there so they can make wise choices as adults, and so they can understand why these restrictions are being imposed. And then the last part of that E is exemplify. And you were asking about parents earlier with the detox, but I really do encourage parents, like, we have to just ask ourselves the hard questions of, are we using our smartphones the way we'd want our grown children as adults to be using their phones? Because they will imitate us. We are the models and the examples. And so the best way we can actually train them to use technology wisely is not by handing them a technology, a tool that is too powerful for them to handle before they're ready for it, but by modeling as adults how we can wisely steward and use this technology. The same with driving a car. We're not letting 5-year-olds drive motor vehicles, but we are driving and modeling for them good driving behaviors the whole time until they're at an age where they can handle it. And it's the same with the smartphone. And so we do, as parents, have to, I think, just adopt better practices around our own phone use so that it's not interfering with our family relationships, and so that we're really showing our kids that we approach using the phone as a tool. It's not something that is addictive or distracting to us that sucks us away from real life. So a lot of these parents and these families have adopted practices like dumbing their own smartphones down, taking the internet browser off their phone, or putting it in grayscale, just ruthlessly eliminating apps that you don't really need to have on your phone, turning off notifications, hiding apps away in folders, just anything that we can do to make it less addicting and distracting to us. And then they really do separate themselves physically from their devices when they're with their kids having family dinner. There's a phone box or some type of place to put the phone so they can be fully present as a family until their kids go to bed. So those are kind of the best practices in terms of how we model good use for our kids. A is very brief, just adopt alternatives. I wanted parents to know there are a lot of better phone options available as an alternative to a smartphone when a child does reach an age where they have more independence and they need some type of communication tool. So all these families really delayed the age of first cell phone as long as possible, until high school, late high school, when the child was actually driving or moving around independently. And then they opted for one of these alternative phones instead of a smartphone that are very tool-based phones that have talk and text and maybe a GPS for driving, but no kind of social media apps, gaming apps, no internet browser, nothing that would be addicting and kind of drawing a child in. So I give lots of examples of those alternatives in the book, but that chapter was really meant to empower parents that you don't have to kind of feel pressured into the smartphone just because your child all of a sudden needs some way to communicate with you. There's other options available. And then S is setting up digital accountability in the home and family screen rules, because I would get lots of questions. Okay, well, then what do you do about computers in the home or televisions? And so what I found with these families is they really all shared two key practices, which is any internet use was public and purposeful, And then any screen entertainment was sparing and shared. And so, yeah, there were tech exit children who actually learned how to use the computer as the tool it was meant to be. I love to share the story of this one boy who got really interested in computer science. So his parents let him check out all these computer science books from the library, and he taught himself how to code. And they let him practice his coding skills on the family computer in the living room where everyone could see what he was doing, 20 to 30 minutes a day. And he never had a smartphone, never had social media. And then he won a like coding scholarship, like a full ride to a university in Ohio. And so he's going to be very prepared kind of for the digital workplace and the digital age, but he didn't grow up on a smartphone and social media and the kind of myth that they need these things to be prepared. I mean, the smartphone just teaches kids how to scroll and swipe between apps and be distracted and entertained. It doesn't actually give them real tech skills. And so these families did allow purposeful kind of public internet use, computer use to practice those things or do research, like truly using it as a tool. And then for screen entertainment, that was not a daily occurrence, but it was something that was intentional, kind of on the weekends, and always done as a family, like watching a Friday night family movie night or a Saturday sporting event. But it was always something that was done together, not families members on their own individual devices. So those kind of practices I think are really important just in terms of managing other types of screens in the home. And then T, the end of the acronym just stands for trade screens for real life responsibilities and pursuits. And that chapter was like the most fun to write. It was just getting to tell the stories of all the things that these families do and fill their children's time with instead. And the one thing I always like to note about this chapter is it was not just they were replacing their kids' time with hobbies and art and sports and music, which are all great things. But really, these families were oriented fundamentally around service and teaching their kids service to others, first in the home, being part of a family, learning to serve the family. That starts with like very basic household chores, but then gradually taking on more adult like responsibilities around the home. And then as they got older, learning to serve their broader community in their neighborhood, their school, and their church. And I think it really, in a generation that has been called the anxious generation, service is a really amazing antidote to anxiety because it really takes kids' eyes off themselves and helps them lift their eyes up to God and out to others in their community. And so I would just say, as we're trading these screens for real life things, we want to fundamentally replace those with real life relationships and that responsibility and service to others that really helps kids progress towards adulthood, where screens just stunt them. And so that is Feast. There's a lot more details in the book, but that is the kind of overall positive vision. And those are the kind of 5 key components that help these families truly sustain this lifestyle over the long term. And they did it very successfully and honestly in a very thriving and flourishing way. In talking to all these families, this was not a life of drudgery, of restrictions, but they were really like, no, this is like the fundamentally most positive no, because the no to screens is really just a yes to so much more in real life. And so I just always want to end on that positive note that this is it's really it's truly it's a path to freedom and real human flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I really like the distinction between fasting from the social media and the smartphone and then feasting on real life. I'm going to ask one or two more questions. I'm just looking at, we're now at the top of the hour. For anyone who's watching who would like to ask a question, just use the chat feature. So if you just click on the little chat button, you can type in a question, and then I'll be able to, read through those and ask some to Claire before we have to wrap up tonight. But Claire, I also liked the story that you told about the family where the child had no social media, no smartphone, but there was a computer in the living room, and he, won a full scholarship to be a computer scientist undergrad. Because I remember I gave a talk one time about like it was a talk about the future of education, and there were a bunch of educators in the room, and I mentioned something about we need to be really deliberate about what sort of technology we allow at our schools. And all of the teachers loved it. And then someone kind of cornered me afterwards saying, no, no, you're entirely wrong about that. Our kids won't be ready for the workforce. They won't be ready unless we teach them about technology. And that means they need to have smartphones and social media. And it sounds like from what you're saying, not true at all. But tell us a little bit about schools, because I've heard horror stories where the school requires people to be on Facebook because that's how the coach communicates about practice times and game times, and it's only through like a Facebook page. And there's some school, the Chromebook in every classroom, or the Chromebook for every student, right? Where every student now has their own personal screen, or textbooks that are only available on the Chromebook. So there's no actual physical book. It's only on your tablet. But then on the other side, there are schools that have from bell to bell, no personal devices in the building. Other schools that say no personal devices at all. And like the whole family is going to kind of like sign a covenant to do that. Walk us through, this spectrum, the good, the bad, the ugly, and
Mhm.
how important really the school environment is. Because like, the family environment's important, but families can't do this on their own. The next kind of concentric circle would be like the school. How do we think about that?
Yes. So I think, unfortunately, for a long time, many schools have actually been part of the problem instead of part of the solution. So many families have said, we avoided screens in our house, and they were then forced on us by the school. Like the child had to have the one-on-one laptop or the tablet, Chromebook. It was really kind of all pushed down through the schools. And so the chapter in the book I have towards schools is trying to encourage schools in a better direction and giving them this positive vision that, because, like you were just saying, of the collective aspect of this community and the fact that so much of a child's social environment, it's their learning environment, but it's also their social environment during the entire school day, that it can be really powerful if schools kind of support parents in this tech exit approach by kind of creating a very thick school culture, that is low tech or kind of no tech. And so it's not just about what happens during the school day, but schools also have a tremendous amount of influence to be able to change the culture beyond the school day to encourage parents. We would encourage you to opt out of smartphones. I know like 24 schools in the UK got together and they all sent a note home to the parents just saying, we want our town to become like the first smartphone free town. We don't want children to have smartphones during childhood. And so it wasn't just about banning the phones during the school day, but that the school can actually help set the tone for the community even beyond the school day. So I really believe in kind of harnessing the power of schools. And so this whole chapter was really oriented towards, okay, what can schools do to support parents? And there's a lot, but I mean, the first most basic thing is like what you just mentioned, is just banning personal devices and cell phones, smartphones from bell to bell. And the bell to bell piece is really critical because I think a lot of school districts would say they've banned phones for a long time from classroom time, but that's not sufficient. It's actually very difficult for teachers to be constantly the phone police, but you need a kind of bell to bell school wide ban where from the start of the school day to the end of the school day, there's no phones or devices, and there's kind of strict enforcement and penalties for violations so that it really is followed. And where school districts have successfully implemented these bans, they see tremendous improvements, not just in academic outcomes for students, but actually the whole social environment. There's greater respect for teachers from the students, greater camaraderie and interaction between students, less discipline issues. It just improves the whole tone of the school day, just getting rid of the devices. And then I really encourage schools to go a step further, not just think about the phones, but also think about these screens that have been on every child's desk. And I will say there are lots of schools who are doing a great job at this, like classical schools. There's been a huge revival in classical education, and they have taken a very no tech, low tech approach, using books and paper. But I do fear a lot of our public school districts are still very heavily kind of invested in these one-to-one educational screens that the data just consistently shows is not improving educational outcomes. It's actually undermining them. And our scores have been in the United States consistently dropping since 2012. And so the lowest scores were seen after the pandemic, but the trajectory had started long before then, kind of after the introduction of all these ed tech screens. And it turns out the neuroscience shows that kids do not learn as well on a screen. They don't comprehend text as deeply. They don't develop as strong of reading circuits in their brain if they're reading primarily on screens instead of on paper. And just to share a little bit of a hopeful example, the country of Sweden was one of the earliest adopters of this kind of ed tech vision that like this was the future. Every kid was going to get a screen and they were going to be like advancing all their educational outcomes. So they went like completely textbookless in 2009. It was like all screens across the country in their schools. Well, they have reversed course
Mm.
just because they've looked at the data that the kids are not doing as well learning through the screens. And so Sweden's now invested about $1 million in reversing course, and they're making sure that every student has a paper textbook in every subject by the end of 2025. And so I really hope and pray that the US will not be afraid to reverse course when we see that the data is not that this is not working. The data is showing us this is not the way that children learn best. And especially you were mentioning AI at the beginning. I'm afraid these negative trends are only going to be exacerbated by now integrating AI tutors into the screens, because now not only will children be missing out of the cognitive benefits of reading on paper, but the AI will be offering to summarize the texts for them. So they won't even be reading it or writing things themselves. The AI will be doing it for them. And so I hope we can kind of turn the ship around before it's too late. And I'm encouraged some school districts that are doing this, that are, as budget decisions come up, they're deciding not to refurbish and replace all the laptops, but to instead kind of invest in a school computer lab or computer carts where there's screens that are kind of on a cart and they are brought into a class for a very specific purpose, but they're not giving the kind of one-to-one devices to all the students. And so I'm hoping more and more schools follow that direction.
Yeah. All right. So we looked at what like the family can do. We next kind of circle out what the school can do. Let's go to like the largest circle. What's the role of the state here? What's the role of public policy? Obviously, like, our institution, it's ethics and public policy. So, we focus on both of these things. How should we think about what policy solutions are required in this area?
Yeah, so I often explain, it's a both and. We both need parents doing everything they can on the front line, and we need the government to critically back parents up in some crucial ways. Especially, this is the most obvious or most clear when there are actually collective elements of harm, and that's the case with smartphones and social media. Is that the effects of these technologies are not just individual. The harms are not just individual, but as I was mentioning, they change the entire social environment and social dynamics for kids, and that even if a child is not on social media or doesn't have a smartphone, but a few of the peers in their class or their group are using them, they can still experience some of what Jonathan Haidt calls these negative network effects of the technologies, where they may still feel some of that, the anxiety or depression, or the feeling of isolation or loneliness because of how the devices change their social environment and the social dynamics. And then the second part of that collective problem is that, unfortunately, if I do everything I can to keep my child off a smartphone, but another child in my class has a smartphone, has access to it during the school day, and can pull up pornography on their phone and show that to my child, that is a collective problem. And so, I think with a lot of these kind of collective problems, it really necessitates a public policy solution, a very kind of common sense approach. And I look in my work at different precedents for other kind of addictive substances or activities we recognize are inherently harmful to children. We have age restricted them. And so a lot of the things I've worked on have just been age restrictions, age verification for pornography websites, so that truly only adults are accessing this material, and that the onus is not on parents to go shut down every possible point of entry or loophole to a pornography website, but it's on the pornography websites to make sure that they are restricting their content to only be accessible to adults. And then I advocate for similar solutions around social media, that raising the age of social media, placing a higher age restriction on that, really again helps provide a kind of collective norm for the whole, that kids aren't getting on social media until 16 or 18 because of the harmful effects that we've seen. And the country of Australia has now done this. They've raised the age of social media to 16. I know Denmark has just decided to raise it to 15. And so I would love to see the US actually raise the age of social media, because the current age of 13 was really not intended to be set for social media. It's just the default because of another law from 1998, well before social media, that just says companies cannot collect children's data without parental consent under the age of 13. And so, because companies collect massive amounts of data, they have just set the de facto age of social media to 13. And so I advocate for much more parental involvement. So I've worked on state social media parental consent laws because right now kids can just click a box, falsify their birth date, and they have an account, and a parent has no idea that they have now entered into this giant contract with a tech company. And so really trying to put parents back in the driver's seat of their kids' online experiences. And then, yes, you mentioned at the beginning, now we're turning our attention to these dangerous AI companion chatbots and saying these are absolutely not safe for kids to be interacting with, and trying to encourage states to age restrict those as well.
Yeah. All right, so let's turn to the questions in the chat because we already have a bunch of that have come in. And the first one deals with kind of high school employment. So in the sense here, I'll just read it to you. It says, "My 15-year-old son got his first job, and it was all done via phone. And his employer actually got mad at us for having it on our phone, right? So rather than the 15-year-old, it was on the parent's phone. And another employer didn't post anything online. You had to go in person. So the staff posted the schedule via Snapchat, and I had to come to my phone, and my phone was constantly being bombarded with messages that were not related to work. It is a work issue that's very frustrating to parents because they need to answer chats or reschedule, et cetera. What is the advice here when the employer is doing everything via, Snapchat or, text messages or something like that?
Yes.
How should the parent think about? Because, we want our teenage kids to have jobs. It's character building. It's, that's a good part. That's real life rather than online life. But what if the employer is running it through the phone like this?
Yes, this is such a common frustration. Actually, I hear a lot is it's employers or it's coaches that are basically requiring the kid to have some type of app that then necessitates a smartphone. So I know it's difficult, but I feel like these are actually great opportunities to help our children actually develop kind of these skills of courage and bravery, and us as the parents explaining to them kind of how to navigate these conversations, to explain like I don't have a smartphone, and offering other kind of options and solutions and workarounds, like if the boss could send schedule updates via email, or instead of sending the picture via Snapchat, send it via an email account where they're allowed to check their email a few times a day in case there's an update from the employer. And I don't know the particular situation with your 15-year-old, but I think even some of the non-smartphone alternatives, they can receive text messages or even picture messages. So maybe just explaining, they're not going to do this through the Snapchat app. We're not giving them access to social media, but you could send the message this way. So I know it's not like the easiest path, but I think just having those conversations and actually training our kids to have these conversations, because I do think honestly it teaches them how to advocate for themselves, which is a skill that they will need in life and that they will need in the workplace, maybe not specifically always around technology. But I do think that these are actually learning moments for our kids where we can try to come alongside them, and again, engage in conversations to try to all work towards a solution, but just being clear on our boundaries with the employer, like our child will not be getting a smartphone. Can we find another way? Can we find a workaround? And I have seen that work successfully with other situations. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the easiest path. And I'm very clear throughout the book that the tech exit is not the easiest or path of least resistance. But I do think it is what is best for our kids. And I always want parents and teens to know that they should never feel pressured into getting a smartphone, but for these external reasons. That is a very intentional decision that should really ultimately be the parents, and parents should not feel pressured into it for kind of these outside reasons.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is about YouTube, and I can more or less just summarize it. But the concern is about the addictive nature of the algorithm, and especially with kids. And has it gotten more addictive over time? And what are you seeing in the research with the YouTube, the kind of video constant feed of recommended
Mhm.
videos, the addictive nature, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, so I consider YouTube social media. I think it's highly addictive. I think the algorithms have gotten more aggressive. I think that like all these social media companies, they're all competing with their competitors. And as you know, TikTok has gotten more addictive and personalized in its algorithms. I think the other platforms have been trying to kind of keep up. And so I do really encourage parents, like even if your child's not on smartphones or doesn't have a tablet, that piece about internet use being public and purposeful, I really strongly warn against kids going on YouTube because maybe they're, maybe you let them watch a short educational lecture, but like after that, it has to be cut off because YouTube never has a cutoff. There is no end. It is a infinite feed of content and it can quickly kind of spiral into very weird things, even if you start on something that looks kind of educational. I do feel like the algorithms honestly accentuate vice and kind of prey on human vulnerabilities by like feeding that type of content up to kids. So I really kind of encourage any YouTube use to be like heavily parent supervised. Because I'm not saying there's not good content on YouTube. Like, this webinar will hopefully be posted on the EPPC YouTube channel. So there's certainly, good content out there, but the algorithms do, the infinite feed do make it so dangerous that I discourage YouTube as like an activity where your kids just get to go on YouTube on the computer. And any kind of lecture watching or video watching on YouTube should be very heavily parent supervised. And once it's over, they log off and there's not this kind of continual keep going down the rabbit hole of YouTube.
Yep. All right. So next question. Our eighth grader will be entering high school next fall. There's a potential that he could attend a school that's 35 minutes from our home. So we're thinking he should have a way to contact us. What is your opinion on a flip phone, which would only allow texting versus a smartphone? And maybe just, run through the gamut of
Yeah.
alternatives, just because I'm sure lots of people have this question of we need some way to keep in touch with our kid. What are the alternatives?
Yes. So I would say, the reason that you kind of spelled out of why he would need a phone makes sense. And so that's where I would encourage you to look at those alternatives. And I think, the kind of language of a flip phone versus a smartphone, it's a little more like nuanced now because I've actually had parents say, just be careful. If you go to Verizon and get a flip phone, a lot of these flip phones actually have internet browsers on them or YouTube apps. And it's like a dumb flip phone. You're like, how is that possible? So I actually prefer a lot of these non-smartphone alternatives that are literally meant to be like a locked down phone for a kid to use that has no access to social media or games or an internet browser. And it's like there is no way for a child to get to those things on that phone. And so I really recommend like the pinwheel phone or the Gab phone. And I'm hearing more and more parents saying that they like pinwheel better. It's more customizable, it's more parent friendly to be like really locked down. You can even limit them to have just only approved contacts. So if you didn't want your son texting other people, he could only text his parents. And then I think some parents too have, instead of even doing like the pinwheel phone or Gab phone, they've done like a gizmo watch, which is basically just a watch from Verizon that can call or text just 10 preset numbers and nothing more. And so that is even a more boring interface. If you're purely thinking he just needs a way to get in touch with us, I think even starting with the Gizmo watch can be a better option. And then maybe as they need more functionality, like I know the pinwheel phone and Gab phone both offer GPS for once they're driving, you could kind of graduate to that. So I know a lot of parents who, for like an eighth grader, ninth grader, they've started with one of these kind of not a smart watch, I should clarify. Apple Watch is not what I'm talking about, but a gizmo watch that has like these 10 preset contacts that they can text or call, and then graduating to one of these more controlled non-smartphone alternatives like the pinwheel phone or Gab phone. Or Bark phone. That's kind of what I would recommend. And I list all these in the appendix, and you can go to their websites and see more of the differences and what functionalities they all offer. But that would be my recommendation.
Okay, let me bundle two questions just for the sake of time. Um, One question, what's your advice for navigating the use of screens in early elementary years of school? And then other question, some people say that if we don't have students using laptops at school, then when they have to take standardized tests, they won't be as familiar and therefore they won't do as well, and all the consequences that flow from that. So what's your advice on both ends?
This is so tough. I really just, I can't emphasize enough that I take like the strongest possible stance on not having screens in the classroom, especially those younger years in elementary school. I think if anything, I always encourage parents to just, if that is the case in your school and it's like, nope, starting at kindergarten, they're getting issued this device. I just really encourage parents to talk collaboratively with the teacher and with the principal, the school administrators, and explain your reasoning and just ask if they would make any type of exemption or exception for you. Because I think, like, really every parent that does that, then maybe eventually the teacher just says, you know what, I'm just going to give these assignments out by paper because, you know, several parents in the class now don't want the assignment to be done on the screen. So I think a starting place is just to simply see if you could get an exemption for your own child. You know, maybe you can't change the entire school policy quite yet, but just advocating for your own child, is there a possibility they could complete this assignment by pen and paper? And I will say, like, particularly for parents who have neurodivergent kids who struggle with ADHD or autism, like this is actually is a big issue. I've talked to parents, they say that those children are even more dysregulated by the screens. And so they have really worked with the school administrators to say we really need an exemption because my child is really negatively impacted by the use of screens. So I think for any parent, just starting by simply seeing if they would either kind of eliminate for your child or extremely minimize the use. And I think that can actually have a broader cumulative impact where once they start doing this, maybe for a student or two in the class, like you could talk to other parents in the class as well, then the teacher might actually just decide to make a shift that they're not going to use the screens as much and they're going to do the assignments differently. So I think that's a great starting point. And then on the standardized testing, I love that this got brought up because I've actually been talking to some policy people in Ohio that want to kind of actually bring a piece of legislation to say that standardized testing is going to go back to paper, because I think this has been a reason a lot of schools have gone to doing the screens, is because they're like, oh, we want kids to be prepared for the standardized testing. So I think like a broader policy conversation is just, can we move standardized testing back to paper? But I think in the meantime, I would say like our classical school that our son attends, this is the case. They have no screens ever, but then the kids do have to take the standardized test to be like bringing computers for the testing. And I don't think that their scores have suffered. I will just say that I think these kids have very smart critical thinking and problem solving skills, and it's not that difficult to learn to just push a certain button or make a selection on a screen. I think kids are so naturally intuitive at technology that picking up how to do a standardized test on a screen is not that difficult, and is certainly not a reason that they should be learning through the medium of a screen full time. And I would say if the school is really concerned about that, I would just say, well, okay, could they have a computer class once a week or a computer cart where the computers are brought in for a specific purpose of just preparing them for that interface for the standardized test, but that this is not the means by which they're learning all the time, because most of that learning isn't even happening through the format of a standardized test. It's these videos, these games, they're kind of gamifying the learning on the screens. And so it's not a direct correlation between how the screens are being used for instruction and then how they're being used for standardized testing. So those are my thoughts.
Let me bundle two more, and then we're going to be out of time. So one question, how should adults think about their own smartphone use? Like, is it, since our brain development is already done, is it not as bad? Should we only use it for work? Maybe talk about neuroplasticity and, what that looks like for people our age. And then the other question is, how should parents respond to the argument that, we should give our high schoolers smartphones while they're still under our roof, so we can kind of, monitor it and, watch it, so that then when they go off to college, they don't go crazy, which I think has a parallel. Some people would say, especially like European nations, because alcohol isn't age restricted to
Mm-hmm.
21, it might be 18, there might be even looser rules. In a family setting, you don't see as much binge drinking from college students, for example, because they learn to drink socially and responsibly under the family roof. So if we're using the fentanyl example, why not use an alcohol analogy and say that you're going to navigate alcohol better if you learn to drink responsibly under your parents' roof? So, those are the two basic questions
Yes.
there.
Okay. Well, they're kind of linked because I would say, like, I don't think smartphones are good for adults. And I've made a lot of changes in my life the last 4 years just from all this research. And the things I was saying about the detox, like a lot of the studies of detoxes have been on adults, like 18 to 25-year-olds, and how, going without a smartphone for 2 weeks, like the major improvements they kind of see in their attention span, their ability to focus, their mood, their happiness, their sleep. Everyone's sleep and memory improves when they get off their phone. So there's clearly a negative impact on us. I mean, it's particularly pernicious for children whose brains are still developing and are not fully developed, but even for adults, we are not immune from the addictive effects. And so I would just say I'm encouraged, like there's more and more people I speak to who have moved away from their smartphones because many of these alternative options are actually great for adults. So I have a Wise phone. I can call and text. I have tools on it like a GPS, a camera. I can access Uber and Venmo and all the airline apps. So it's really like anything that's a tool I can access, but there's no internet browser and no social media, nothing that would be like addicting or distracting. And that's been hugely helpful for me as a mom, just trying to be present with my own kids. And I recognize some adults can't do that for work reasons. So the book, How to Break Up with Your Phone by Catherine Price, I recommend this in my appendix in my book, just gives lots of steps for us to really like dumb down our phones to be truly just a tool for us to use and not something that's going to suck our attention away or distract us away from real life and can actually help us preserve our attention and our focus and our memory. So I will say, adults, like I do think we actually need to examine our own practices a lot more closely and ask ourselves and be willing to ask ourselves the question and kind of dare to be bold and just say, do I really need this smartphone? It was college students that did it for me. I came to talk to them on campus about how bad smartphones were, and they had all given up their smartphones for this unplugged scholarship. And then they said, well, do you have a smartphone? I was like, I do. And they were like, you can do it. We did it. We just gave up our smartphones. And I felt so convicted. And I thought, so I told my husband, I was like, well, I guess I could try it for a month and just see how it goes. And I did. And then I kind of never looked back. So just be careful. You never know. You could just take a bold step and that might be it for you. And then on that note, so the same then, the reason I was going to kind of start with that to answer the second question is a lot of the families I spoke to said they just actually started by rejecting the premise of the inevitability of the smartphone, that they just didn't even assume that their kids would get it in college or need to get it because of how inherently addictive this is. They were like, I don't actually even want to be the one to give it to you. So some of the families I spoke with like actually incentivized their kids to stay on their kind of non-smartphone alternative through college by offering to pay for it, and kind of said, if you want to get a smartphone, it's on you. You can pay for it. You can pay for the data plan, but we'd kind of like encourage you not to. We'd encourage you to go through college without it and kind of continue preserving your kind of in-person real life experiences and your attention, your memory. And because of what I was saying under the kind of chapter about explain, educate, and exemplify, they really kind of had convinced their kids, like some of the grown children I spoke to said like they just weren't even really interested in getting a smartphone because they kind of really internalized all these reasons that it was bad, and they didn't want that for themselves. They didn't want that type of distraction during college. Other kids, they did end up getting the smartphone in college, but they said because of kind of all that training and the habits they had formed, they just really aren't very tempted to use it. They're not on their phone very much. They truly go and use it only as a tool. And so I don't think that we have to give it to them to train them on it. I think that most of the training just happens through really intentional conversations and modeling things for them. And you can kind of show them your own smartphone if you want to walk through it. But I think I just really appreciated that principle of just kind of rejecting this premise of inevitability, not even like assuming that they have to get one or should get one during college or even as a young adult. One dad said, let his employer or someone else force it upon him. Like, I don't want to be the one to kind of give it to him. And now other families will differ. I spoke with some families who they did decide once their kids' college applications were in their senior year and that senior spring, they could get a smartphone, but with no social media on it. And they had lots of restrictions around it still in the home to kind of ease them into it. So people take different approaches, but I would just say to the kind of myth of like, you have to give it to them before college to prepare them for it. You actually really don't. There's lots of other ways you can prepare them, and even just encourage them to say, like, you really don't actually have to get a smartphone. It's not a marker of adulthood. You don't have to have a smartphone to be an adult. And maybe you'll be a better adult if you don't get one. So yeah, I think that just not having this assumption that it has to be something that they get at some point and just trying to proactively train them is really the best thing we can do.
Yeah. Perfect. That's a great note to end on. So the book again is The Tech Exit. Claire, this has been wonderful. Thank you. And thank you
Yeah.
for everyone who joined us tonight. And with that, we'll wrap things up. Have a good evening.
I'll just briefly mention if you're curious to find more, I do have a Substack, claremorell.substack.com. So I'll continue putting out resources. I just did a recent post on AI and the harms to kids, and the techexit.com also has some accompanying resources to go with the book, like a tech exit checklist, a discussion guide if you want to read the book as a group of parents, to kind of fulfill that finding other families, read the book with other parents. There's a discussion guide there. And there's like a detox screen free activities kind of tip sheet. So the techexit.com, claremorell.substack.com, and of course, EPPC.org. You can find all my work that way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you all.